Okay, we're going to get going. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Adam Greco, and I work for Search Discovery, and I'm the head of the SDEC. Thanks again for joining another session. This session will be focused on Google Analytics. Before I hand it over to Krista, just wanted to mention a couple things. During the session, if you have any problems, feel free to click the chat button and I will be around to answer any questions. But if you have a question for Krista at the end of the session, it's very important that you use the Q&A button instead of the chat button, because that helps us to store all of the questions. So in case we don't get to all of them live, we can answer them after the fact. So if you have any questions, again, chat. If you have any questions for Krista, go ahead and use the Q&A. So I'm going to turn it over to Krista. Krista is someone who's been a leader in the digital analytics space, has worked as a client. I'm sure she'll tell you a little bit about herself, but also if you're a Google Analytics user, you probably know her from being a product manager and helping with all of the Google Analytics training. So excited to have Krista here. So Krista, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Adam. It is great to be here. And as Adam said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So I am excited to share some of my favorite tips and tricks about Google Analytics today. So I've titled this session, Making the Most of Google Analytics. As you can see, I'm Krista Seiden. I'm the founder and principal consultant of my own analytics consultancy called KS Digital. But prior to being my own consultant, I actually worked at Google for a very long time. So you might recognize me, as Adam mentioned, from some of these videos where I was teaching Google Analytics to the world. And then in between there, I also spent some time as vice president of product marketing and growth at Quantcast. But overall, been in the analytics space for well over a decade and live and breathe Google Analytics. I'm involved in the Digital Analytics Association and I'm a huge advocate for women in analytics. I blog at KristaSeiden.com and I'm on Twitter at Krista Seiden. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Here is our agenda today. So first we're going to talk about things that are no code required. This is site search, campaign tracking, goals, and then we're going to talk about things that have a little bit of code required, events and custom metrics. Then I've got some GTM bonus points for you, and if we have time, a peek ahead to what's coming next with Google Analytics. I do have a disclaimer for you though. I am assuming that you know a little bit about Google Analytics already, and I'm going to jump into specific features right away. So if you do have any questions or you missed something, throw it in the Q&A. We can talk about it at the end, but hopefully you can follow along with me as I jump right in. I'm going to also apologize in advance. My puppy is making some background noise. Sorry about that. Okay, no code required. Site search, campaign tracking, and goals. So site search, what is it? Well, site search collects the search term used on website search box. So in this screenshot, we are looking at my blog. It's called Digital Debrief. This is where I blog about everything analytics and optimization related. And in the top right corner, I have a search box. So if you were to go ahead and click in there and type something in, when you actually type in that search query, I'm going to be able to collect it with what is called site search set up in Google Analytics. Now, this is very useful as an analyst because this is actually your voice of customer. They're telling you exactly what they want, need, or can't find on your website easily, and then you can use that data, mine that data to really understand what's important to your users. So for example, if I go to my own site and I search for GTM in that search box, you can see up in the upper right-hand corner, the URL is going to have a search parameter of GTM. And that little S is what the query parameter is for my particular blog. It varies depending on site. But that is what I'm going to input into Google Analytics. So I like to say this is no code required, but you do have to, find that search query parameter, put it into your admin settings here under the query parameter area. And once you enter that, that's all you have to do. Now you're going to start collecting those search terms in Google Analytics. So what does that data look like? Well, here we have an example, again, from my own blog. And I'm looking at this data and I see, a bunch of people are looking for different things. Number one is App Web. That's Google's new App plus Web technology. Number 16 is web app. I see there's a few more searches for that. But you know, there's not a huge consensus overall, but this is just the top of this list. If you've ever been in Google Analytics and you're looking at a report, the first thing that you're going to see in a table report is the first 10 rows of that report. Now, I like to expand that to see as many rows as possible because there's some very interesting things, and especially when you get into the long tail of site search. So if I keep scrolling down past these top 16 here, like I said, number 1's app and web, at 16 is web and app, but I get down to the 80s. And now you can see there's a bunch of single queries for app web, web app, like all sorts of different combinations of this term. And so this term is actually more popular than I would have been led to believe in the first place because, you know, at first it showed up as the top term, but only with 14. If I keep going down, this is where I can actually start to see some voice of customer things. They're telling me full sentences. People tend to do this in search boxes sometimes. They'll type in full sentences. That's actually collected here. And so, you know, this person is saying, is this for a web event or an app event? Can I use GTM to set this up? They're still wanting to know more about app and web, but they're asking a full sentence question. Further down still, please help. No one explains how to get data in both GA and GA for Firebase, which is also app plus web, and how GTM works with this. So again, people still looking for this qualitative feedback here. And then finally, if I go all the way to the bottom, some people even use the search box to compliment you. You can see number 250 there. Thanks, Krista, for your passion for GA. Appreciated meeting you. Best of luck. Really nice, but that's something I never would have seen if I hadn't scrolled past those first 10 rows in this report. So I guess my tip here is a couple-fold, right? Site search is great for really understanding that voice of customer, but it's also that you need to get past those first 10 rows so that you can really understand the collective importance here. You know, I've seen at least 30 now searches for app and web overall, meaning that this is something that my users, my readers are looking for. Maybe I should blog more about it. So moving on to campaign tracking. Campaign tracking, also known as UTM tracking in Google Analytics, is how you actually get data from all incoming sources into Google Analytics to tell you where they came from. People can come from organic or PPC, display, social, email, all sorts of things to be able to come to your website. And you want to be able to know which channel they actually came from. So UTM tracking is something that you can use then to track your online and offline referrals, and it's broken into 4 parts. The first part is your campaign. You're going to track your overarching campaign. An example of this would be Winter Sale 2019. Then you have your medium. This is the medium that's used to actually send your campaign. So for example, if email is what you're doing, then you might want to use email for your medium. If you're doing some search ads, you'd use CPC. If you're doing something on social networks, you might use social or paid social. Source is then used to differentiate the type of medium. So if your medium was CPC for paid search, then your source is going to be the actual search network. So Google, Bing, Baidu, and so on. If your medium was email, source is a little bit more open here. You can use things like try, buy, awareness to track the type of email that you're sending and the type of CTA that you're trying to get users to click on. And then finally, the last field is content. Now, this is essentially a bonus field. A lot of people don't use it, but I would highly suggest that you do because it can actually be used to track so many differentiating factors about your campaign. So for example, if you are sending an email and maybe you are testing it to 2 different audiences, you're split testing and they're getting 2 different offers, an offer for $60 off, an offer for 15% off. You can actually put that offer in the content field and then right in Google Analytics, that's there for you to interpret very easily, very human readable, so that you don't have to go back and look up what, you know, offer ID they had or something. It's right there. You can more easily do your analysis. And then finally, you put it all together into this long, ugly URL, and you have the URL that you would actually put into your campaigns. All right, so that long, ugly URL, kind of hard to build. Google has you covered here. They have a URL builder. so that you don't have to actually remember all the places to put everything there. You just kind of enter your different things in this builder and it will build it for you. There's a couple downsides to this builder. You can only do one at a time. It doesn't really keep track of it for you. And so I've actually gone ahead and built my own spreadsheet template for this. It's linked here. You can see the short link at the bottom, krista.me/UTM-template. This is a great way to be able to keep track of your UTMs. And I highly suggest that you do put it in some sort of a spreadsheet or some place to be able to keep track of them so that you have a reference to go back and look at all of the different campaigns that were in market and when they launched and all those sorts of things, so that when you see that data come to Google Analytics, you know where it came from. So a quick example for you. Here you can see these are 2 screenshots from the Million Mile Secrets guy. So this is a guy who is a travel blogger, and he blogs about different offers and deals related to travel. And here he is blogging about a free $30 credit towards your first ride with Uber. Now, there's something wrong here. One of these screenshots is from Facebook and one is from Twitter. I'm gonna give you guys just a second to take a look at this. And then I'm gonna tell you, if you haven't already caught it, he's using the exact same bit.ly for both posts. So what does this mean? Well, this means that he's never gonna know if they came from Facebook or Twitter. He's seeing the same source on both posts because he's using the same shortened URL. You have to use separate shortened URLs because you want to have one for Twitter, one for Facebook. So instead, this is something he should have done. I rebuilt his URL for him here, and I said UTM campaign is social post. Medium is social, source is Twitter or Facebook, depending on which channel. And content is going to be a combination of the date and the title of the post you're sending traffic to. And then I went ahead and I sent a couple of test hits to my own blog just so I could show you what this data would look like. So you can see here we have one incoming hit from Facebook and one from Twitter. And when I actually pull this data in Google Analytics, I come over to my campaign data and I have social post as my campaign. If I click in here, now I have my source medium of Facebook social or Twitter social, so exactly what I want to see there. And if I add a secondary dimension of content, I'm actually going to see that now broken down by the date and title of the post that I was driving traffic to. Now, it's not super impressive here with just one post, but imagine if I had a ton of different posts in here, say for my own blog, and now I can start to actually see which social network or which way I'm posting these blog posts, which one is more popular with different audiences or different topics, right? So I can see maybe if I post about GTM, I get more traffic from LinkedIn, or if I post about Google Analytics, I get more traffic from Twitter, and so on. Really cool analysis that you can do here with this kind of scrutiny with your UTMs. Okay, moving on to goals. So goals in Google Analytics are a way to record that something happened once in a session. And you can set them up in the admin section. Here I have just a quick example of some goals that you might use as a publisher. So maybe somebody went 2 pages deep in your site or 3 pages deep, or they scrolled through a whole article, or they clicked on a related post, something like that. You can imagine goals for all sorts of websites, right? An e-commerce website would definitely have a goal of a checkout complete. Somebody signing up for a free trial would have a goal of a form complete or a free trial form complete or something like that. And what I really like about goals is not necessarily the reporting specifically on goals, but using goals in your reporting. So almost every table report in Google Analytics looks like this. There are some exceptions. Events, for example, look different. But here I'm in a source medium report, and you see it across the top, you have your ABCs of Google Analytics: acquisition, behavior, and conversion. And in the conversion section, I've actually selected a goal on my own website. So I have goal number 6, that pages are greater than 1. So in this case, I'm tracking that people have gone more than 1 page deep on my site as a goal. And now I can start to see by source medium, so by referral channel, which different channels are actually performing better in terms of people being interested in the content on my site and clicking around and looking at more things. So I can see number 4, LinkedIn, has a pretty low rate here of goal completion, only 7.5%. So the traffic coming from LinkedIn is not super qualified for me. But traffic coming from my friend SimoHava.com as a referral to my site, that actually has a goal completion rate of 45%. So people coming from his site are actually highly qualified and are spending much more time on my site looking around. And this lets me know the type of areas that I want to target for future campaigns or future posts that I'm putting out. Likewise, I can actually look at other reports in Google Analytics, such as my device category report or my browser report, to look for issues that are going on. So here I'm looking at a goal for a trial sign up complete, and I'm looking at it by device category, so desktop, tablet, and mobile. And when I look at that conversion rate, I can see that overall it's 0.92%, but for desktop, it's actually doing pretty well, 1.02%. But tablet and mobile are half or less than that. So they're performing pretty badly. So in this case, I might take this data and say to my development team, hey, it seems like maybe we don't have a mobile optimized sign-up flow. Should we consider investing in this? We have some traffic that's coming here, and overall about 16% of traffic is coming to our website from one of these, but they're not really hitting an optimized flow, so we're not converting them. So a great way to use goal data here. And then if you are a 360 client of Google Analytics, goals are also available in your multi-channel funnel reports. So 360 is the paid version of Google Analytics for anyone who wasn't aware. And when you're looking at this report in particular, the model comparison tool, out of the box, up on the upper left-hand corner of this report, it's going to have your conversion section. When you pull this report, it's actually going to have all conversions. So all goals, all e-commerce, all floodlights automatically checked on for you. Now that is not what you want to look at, because that's confusing. You're not able to tease out what's actually going on. And so you actually want to click on this drop down and change it to just one thing. And in this case, I changed it to just one goal type of a form complete. And now I can actually look at different attribution models by a particular goal. So last interaction versus first interaction versus Google's own data-driven model here. And then I can see something like, well, page search is a last interaction, did okay, a little bit better as a first interaction, even a little bit better as data-driven. So overall, first interaction model here, 13% better, data-driven, 15% better. But it gets really interesting when you look at something like display. Display is typically a top of funnel tactic, right? But when I look at it as a last interaction model, which is close to what Google uses for most of its reporting, it actually performs really poorly. Have you ever looked at your campaign reports and looked at display and said, well, display doesn't convert for me. Why would I spend money there? That's why you need to look at this report. Because while it looks like it's not converting as a last interaction, as a first interaction, it would have actually led to a ton of conversions and data-driven somewhere in the middle. So if you look at the change here, first interaction performs over 3,500% better than last interaction for display, and data-driven performs 323% better. Basically saying that, you're really underrating the value of some channels, or maybe overrating the value of some channels if you're not understanding all of the different attribution models you might be seeing based on your goals. Okay, so that was our no code required section. I know I went through it a little fast, but there's a lot to cover, and I want to make sure to give you all my greatest tips and tricks. So moving on, a little code required, events and custom metrics. So event tracking in Google Analytics is, in my opinion, fundamental to being able to really understand what's going on your website, to understand different click interactions, but it does require additional code implemented, either hard-coded on your site or through Google Tag Manager. And that means that, a lot of people aren't actually taking full advantage of event tracking. So what is it? Well, if you're in your Google Analytics account, here I'm in the demo account for Google Analytics. I can go to behavior, events, top events, and I'll see a list of all of my event categories. Now, events are broken up into 3 pieces: category, action, and label. It's a hierarchy. And this is what it looks like. So it's actually very free form. You can use these for whatever you want, but this is how I like to use them. This is what Google recommends. So category, you're going to use for the location of your event. homepage, about us page, resource page, something like that. You can also use it to track the overall type of interaction, so CTA clicks or outbound link clicks, if that's your preference. Action is going to be the actual action the user took. Video, white paper download, starting a trial, and so on. And then label is going to be specifics about your action. So the video name, the white paper name, a detail of the link clicked if there are multiple with the same action, and so on. Label just really gives you more specifics about what it is a user is doing on your website. And so when you put all this together, you're probably asking yourself, well, what does this look like in Google Analytics? And how do you actually use it? So I use it for a lot of things. I use event tracking to typically track all clickable links on the site that I want to be able to understand interaction with. But I also like to use it for form field interaction. And this is really my big tip for you here that not everyone really thinks of doing, is actually implementing each individual form field with on-change events so that you know when somebody has actually gone ahead and started to enter text in that field. This is great for things like single page forms or multi-page sign-up flows or checkout flows, so you can really understand how people are progressing through your flows and exactly where they are dropping off. So a real example here, a few years back, I had the opportunity to implement the Google Analytics marketing website with Google Analytics, how meta. And I used the same format that we talked about. So category is the location. In this case, it could be the home page, the tag manager overview page. If we look at line number 8, the contact form, and we click in there, we'll get to the next level, which is the action. So here I'm using the action to actually tell me which product somebody was interested in when they clicked on contacting the sales team on this form. And so in this case, it could be a single product, it could be all of them. If we click into the first one, Analytics 360 Suite, this is where you're actually going to see those individual labels, or sorry, those individual form fields. So you have your first name, last name, job level, email, etc. Now I want to call out here that in table reports in Google Analytics, they are typically organized by the first column of metric after the primary dimension. So usually this would have been organized by your total events. I have reorganized this table by unique events. You can tell because there's a drop down or a pointing down arrow in the upper right hand corner. All you need to do is click the title here of the column and it will rearrange by that column to see an actual funnel. And so what I look at here now, I can see the drop off in between these fields is not that big, right? It's doing pretty well. People are actually progressing through this form pretty much in order. There's one outlier here, that's region. That's because that was an optional field in the form. But there's something else that I want to point out to you. So I'm going to give you just a second to look at this and try to figure out what is wrong here. And then I'll tell you. Okay, did you guys see it? Did you see line number 9 here? The total events for submit is, almost 5x what the unique events are. And that is because people are clicking on that submit button, not being able to submit and, trying it again and again in frustration. And so I saw this data and I said, well, something's not right here. Let me go to the actual form and see if I can figure out what that is. I put on my UX hat at that point, right? And I go in and I say, okay, this form, why do people keep hitting submit without being able to actually submit? Why are they getting errors? And what I noticed was that how in most forms, they'll have a little asterisk to notate that it is a required field. Well, this form had those, but they were really light gray and very small. And so my hypothesis was that people were actually just missing that these fields were required. They filled out a few things, tried to submit, got an error, filled out something more, tried to submit, got an error until they finally filled everything out that they needed to. And so I brought this back to my development team and the marketing team, and I said, hey, I think we should fix this. And we did, and good news, we saw those numbers come much more back in line because of it. But that's an insight we wouldn't have had if it hadn't been for actually tracking these on-change events and these form field interactions. So pretty cool use of event tracking here. Okay, the last thing I have for you in this section is custom metrics. Now this is something that not everybody uses, and there's not always a use case, but they can be very useful. And so I like to actually implement custom metrics on events. So let's think about it for a second, right? An event was a combination of a category, action, and label. So a combination of 3 dimensions that we have to look at. A custom metric is just one dimension, or one metric, right? And so if I can implement a metric to fire every time my combination of 3 dimensions fire, I can analyze that data easier. And so on my own site, I actually have an event called Continue Reading, and I have an event called Newsletter Subscribe, but I also am firing custom metrics with each of those events so that I can then, in a custom report, pull this nicely into a single table here and look at my landing page by where I'm getting these interactions from users in a much simpler way. Okay, some GTM bonus points for you guys. Now, I talked about those custom metrics just now. I wanted to quickly show you a very easy way to implement them. So 2 steps. In Google Analytics, I have to come into my admin section and I have to actually create a custom metric. This is going to be under the property section titled custom dimensions, custom metrics. And I'll just add a new custom metric, and then it will let me assign a name, and it will assign me an index number. Now I need to know that index number for implementation. So if I'm looking at this Continue Reading event, it's index number 2. And if I go over to Google Tag Manager and I find my event for event Continue Reading is what I've called it in Google Tag Manager. Up above here is all the setup for the actual event, but when I scroll down into the more settings, then I can actually see where I can implement my custom dimensions and my custom metrics. And so I've just added my index of 2, and I've given it a metric value of 1. I just want this to increment 1 time every time this event fires. And so that's how easy it is to actually set up that custom metric. 2 other tips here in this section of things that are really easy to set up in Google Tag Manager that I love. So scroll tracking trigger. Now, scroll tracking is something that can be useful in a lot of cases, some cases not so useful. But people do love it, and it used to be very, very hard to implement. It used to take a lot of code to do this on your page, very heavy. But thanks to the trigger that came out, I think this came out maybe 2.5, 3 years ago at this point, in Google Tag Manager, you can do this very simply. You just create a new event. In this case, I called it GA event scroll tracking. And I did my category as scroll tracking. My action is going to be my scroll depth threshold. This is a built-in variable within Google Analytics. And my label I'm doing is page path, so where they were. And then I have a new trigger called scroll depth. And this trigger, basically, I set to the threshold I set the threshold in the variable, but the scroll depth trigger will allow this to then fire. So it took me about, 3 minutes to set this up. And I went over to real-time analytics after I set this up, and I checked it out. I went to my homepage, I scrolled all the way down, and I could easily see those hits coming in for scroll tracking. So again, super easy to set up, 3 minutes versus what used to be hours and hours of long amounts of code. And then even more useful is the element visibility trigger. Now this one is really cool because kind of like scroll tracking, you can trigger this to fire an event when somebody hits a certain point of your page. But in this case, it's based on the visibility of a certain element on your site. And so for example, I have a newsletter subscribe box on my website. And I have an event called newsletter subscribe or newsletter element visibility. So my category, I just grouped it all into element visibility. The action is that the newsletter subscribe is visible, and my label again is my page path. But I'm triggering this based on when the actual newsletter subscribe box becomes visible on the site. And within this trigger, I can set it up to say that the box has to be 100% visible or 50% visible on the site. And I can set a certain minimum time limit that it has to be visible. So for example, I think I have it set for, 200 milliseconds. It has to be visible at least 50% to count for this event to fire. So I have that firing here. You can see in my real time. But what's really cool about this is I can then go over to Google Analytics and create a calculated metric of the denominator being the number of times that my newsletter was actually, the box was actually visible, and the numerator being how many actual newsletter subscribes I got. So I can actually get a much more realistic idea of my newsletter subscription rate based on who actually saw the box to subscribe to. Pretty cool. Okay, I'm just gonna go through this real quick so we have a few minutes left for questions, but I just wanted to leave you with a peek ahead. We've talked a lot about Google Analytics and some of my tips for making the most of what's there today. But as I talked about in the first section on site search, there's a new product called Google Analytics App and Web. And this is a new way of thinking about Google Analytics. It's a different property type in Google Analytics. And it kind of flips the current data model on its head. Now, I actually think there's a session coming up in CDEC in a few weeks that's going to cover this in detail. So I'm not going to go over too much, but I just wanted to tease you a little bit here to get you interested. So this is what the dashboard for App and Web looks like. And you can already see some of the differences, right? So these are some of the metrics that you don't actually have, metrics and dimensions that you don't have in Google Analytics for Universal Analytics that you know and love today. And there are a few things that make App and Web different. So first, it combines multiple data sources, right? The name suggests you can have app and web. You don't have to have both. You can use it for just web, or you can use it for just app, or you can use it for both. But in this case, you can see I have this set up under data streams, and I'm pulling in an app and a web data stream. And the app one's in iOS, I can have Android. I can bring it all into the same property, and it will dedupe that data for me across by user. And it does that by tying identity across platforms. So it'll use device ID and user ID if you allow it. And if you don't have a specific user ID, then it will tie you together by device ID as best it can. And App and Web is completely event-based. So this is very different than Google Analytics today. It's more similar to what people call a product analytics platform, which, if you ask me, Google's just done a pretty poor job of marketing Google Analytics as something that can do product analytics, because it certainly can in its current form. But being completely event-based is much more similar to some of these other newer analytics platforms out there. And this is kind of how you see all of this organized into a single event table here. It also has access to your raw event data with a free BigQuery export. So this is different than the free version of Google Analytics. In Google Analytics today, there is no free export. There is no export to BigQuery. You have to have the 360 version of Google Analytics to have an export. But in App and Web, there's a free export to BigQuery. So really big differentiator here. And then of course you can explore and visualize all your raw event data from BigQuery in Data Studio. And the last thing I'll leave you with here is this is a new data model. So it's based on events and parameters rather than page views and sessions, which we have today. So one quick example here, a publisher, if you have a piece of content, let's say you're the New York Times and you have a new article on your website. Maybe that article appears on the homepage and in the technology section and in one or two other sections of the website. Now before, you would have analyzed this by page views. How many page views does this article have? But it appeared in a lot of places. There might be other things on those pages. So it's not a true understanding of how many eyes are really on that piece of content. But in App and Web, when the actual content itself is in view, you can fire an event called Content View. And you can have parameters like content title, content author name, content author ID, and you can have up to 25 parameters in the free version of App and Web. And then Google will automatically append the page name and page title. So you can still do some analysis by page, but more importantly for something like a publisher, you can easily, more easily aggregate all of those different content views together in a new way. So pretty cool difference in this data model, really flipping it on its head. If you want to learn more about this, come to the session in a few weeks hosted by CDEC, but also I wrote an extensive blog series on App and Web. So if you go to my blog, look for App and Web, there's a ton of different blog posts going into all different topics on app and web itself. So that is what I have for you today. I'm going to say thank you very much. And I think we have a few minutes for Q&A. Looks like there's a bunch of questions that have come in.
Yep, awesome. Thank you so much, Krista. And such a wealth of knowledge. And believe it or not, this was kind of Krista's intro session. So we've talked about doing a more advanced session on app and web and having Krista show advanced tips. So I can only imagine what that session will be like. So thank you so much. So let's see if we can get to kind of some short answers to a bunch of questions here that came in. I'll just start shouting them out, and if they're too long of a question, then go ahead. We can answer in written format. One question here: what's the best way to download a large amount of raw data from GA?
So there's options to download as like a CSV or something, but you're not going to get the full unsampled data set if you are encountering sampling unless you are a 360 customer. But you can use like the API is a great way and connect it to Google Sheets, or use Data Studio to be able to get that data out as well. The API into Google Sheets might be your best bet here.
Okay, another question came up around internal campaigns. For tracking internal campaigns, what do you recommend? And is there a way to persist the UTMs and stitch the conversion happening post-click on the internal campaign banners? There's a little discussion going around whether UTM should be used for internal or only external.
Great, I have a very simple answer for you. Please don't ever, ever, ever use UTMs on an internal site. There is debate in the industry about, what the best way to do this is, but I can tell you, to the bottom of my heart, as well as many other people would say, it's a bad idea to ever use UTMs on your own website. So for example, if somebody comes to your website and you're trying to drive them towards clicking on a call to action for starting a free trial, and when they click that call to action, they get taken to a form. I have seen websites where they have put UTMs on that free trial button, on that call to action, as an easier way to be able to track that people have clicked it. Now, what you should be doing here is using event tracking and firing an event when somebody clicks that CTA button. But if you use UTMs, a couple things are going to happen. So first and foremost, when you change UTMs, it resets the session. So you're actually going to increase your session count. So now instead of one session where somebody came to your site, clicked the free trial button and filled out a form, you now have that broken up into two sections, one where they came to the site and clicked the free trial button, and then one where they came from a free trial button and filled out a form. So you've artificially inflated your session count, which is never good. But two, when you are looking at the now new session for completing the form, you're not going to know where they actually came from other than that they came from that button that they clicked on. What you really want to know with UTMs is, did they come from paid search? Did they come from social media? Where did they come from? What were my marketing efforts that drove them to actually sign up for this free trial? And if you use UTMs on your own website, you're going to overwrite that and never know that answer. So please, please, please don't ever use UTMs on your own website unless they are pointing externally. So if you're pointing to somebody else's website from a link on your website, totally fine to use UTMs, but never when you're pointing to your own website. That's when you would use events.
Okay. One person asked, what is data-driven in attribution modeling? And someone had responded that it's Google's algorithmic attribution model. I wonder if you could expand upon that.
Yeah, so the data-driven model is Google's, as you said, Google's own model for attribution. And what it looks at is the last 4 touch points of somebody coming to site before they actually convert to whatever conversion goal you're looking at. And then Google applies its own modeling on top of those touch points. It's a little bit of a black box because you don't know how they're pulling the levers of that model, but overall people have been pretty happy with how it comes out, and Google's done a lot of this. They're pretty smart with their modeling. So it tends to be a pretty solid model to use. It is only available to 360 customers though.
Okay, so next question is one I'm excited about because I can actually contribute a little bit of an answer, and I don't know anything about Google Analytics. What is the best method for campaign tracking if you're using both Adobe and Google to capture what is being needed, and one uses UTM and the other uses something else? So before Krista jumps in, I will say that I'm going to put it in the chat. I actually wrote a blog post a long time ago on how you could actually use Google's UTM in Adobe Analytics so that you don't have to worry about this, but I'll see if Krista has anything else that she wants to add.
I'll add that I hate when people misuse UTMs. No, I mean, I think, it's totally fine. I've seen customers who just use both, right? They have certain parameters that they're sending to Adobe and they have their UTMs and it's one really long, ugly URL, but they're able to parse both out to send to the appropriate platforms. Totally fine.
Cool. Next question, can custom metrics be used with the attribution model comparison tool?
No. So custom metrics are only going to be available in custom reports or, pretty much only in custom reports or an analysis. The attribution modeling tool, so the model comparison tool, any of the multi-channel funnel reports are not editable outside of just selecting which goal you're interested in. So they're pretty rigid. You can't do too much, custom work there. It's really what's there and you just select the goal.
Donna asked, do you have any more documentation or instructions for tracking where users fall off on a single page form that you showed a little bit about? Because she wants to do that right away.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a really great method. What I like to use, and I'll be honest with you, this is not something that I actually set up. I'll have a developer set this up, but it's called on-change events. So talk to your friendly developer and ask them to set up some on-change events for when fields are being interacted with in your form. But I do talk about the concept in a blog post on my website. So if you just went to my website and you searched for form field interaction in the search box, you should pull up a blog post that talks about it.
And everyone on the call, just, we're going to take all these questions and we usually try to see if we can beg and plead to have Krista answer some of them after the fact with text where she could put links to stuff as well. Next one is, how and when does scroll tracking trigger? Is continuous scroll one trigger or does it increment every X pixels?
Great question. So I showed you the scrolled up threshold variable was what I was using for the action in that setup. That threshold variable, you actually go in and you assign the frequency of when you want it to fire. So I had assigned 25, 50, 75, and 100%. You can assign it to fire every 10% if you want, or more frequent or less frequent. Just keep in mind that the more events you send, the more hit volume you're sending to Google Analytics, and that can impact your sampling. So I wouldn't be sending it too granularly. With continuous scroll, that's a little harder in terms of the overall percentage. You might want to actually, instead of using scroll tracking there, think of something like element visibility, where you're looking for certain elements down the page that will tell you kind of how far somebody has gone.
Okay, next question. There was a couple responses in this, so I don't know if the question's already been answered, but for Bitly, how does the data pull through in the interface? Do Bitlys in general collapse all the UTMs into the smaller link? Will I see the UTM parameters or the raw Bitly as the source?
You will see the UTM parameters. So when you click a compacted URL, like a Bitly or any other shortened URL, when you click it, it actually opens up into the full long URL in your browser window, and that is what Google Analytics is pulling and reading. So it will pull in all of the UTMs in the full URL into Google Analytics.
Another CTA question. For CTAs on the site, I can either use GTM's built-in button tracking or ask developers to push a data layer event. I heard the latter approach is more reliable in the long term. Do you agree? Do you have a take on this subject?
Yes and no. So yes, I think overall it's great to be able to rely on the data layer, and when this is going to be set in a more systematic way, because sites change, and especially if you're keying off something like an element ID or even a CSS selector, those can change. And so using kind of just the I guess, as you phrased it, the built-in tracking mechanism that way can be somewhat fragile. Depends on how often your site structure is changing and how your developers are working with it. So data layer can often be more reliable in that way, but it does take a little bit extra implementation on the development side. Although setting up a great data layer is something that everyone should strive for.
Okay, a couple more questions, but let's do one more live. The rest, if you want to put your questions in, we can answer after the fact. Which is the one out-of-the-box report that you frequently look to generate insight about your website?
Great question. My go-to report is going to be your source medium report with a secondary dimension of either campaign or content or landing page or something else to really modify that source medium report. But I find a lot of value in understanding uh, the incoming sources of my traffic. So I like that source medium report probably as my favorite out of the box report.
Okay, awesome. Well, we're at our time, so thank you again, Krista, for joining. It's really awesome having experts like you come share your knowledge, and thank you to everyone who joined the webinar. We will be posting this recording in our Slack group, and we have many more webinars coming. So if you know anyone who would enjoy being part of these webinars and wants to get invited, please go ahead and tell them about the SDEC. So again, Krista, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.